The Germans called it the workhorse of the Wehrmacht, the heavy 7-ton Sd.Kfz 7 half-track, a vehicle that had towed 88mm guns across Europe and transported supplies through the mud of Russia. American troops had often seen these massive half-tracks abandoned on roads, disabled in combat, or captured intact as the German war machine collapsed, but they had never actually driven one. Not truly. That changed in the spring of 1945, when GI crews climbed into the driver's seats of these captured German tractors and fired up their Maybach engines. Expectations ran high. They anticipated German engineering precision, powerful engines, and flawless reliability. What they found instead fundamentally altered how American military planners assessed the hidden vulnerabilities that had contributed to the Third Reich's downfall, weaknesses that went far beyond tactics, training, or even industrial output. Often, the most telling insights into an enemy's defeat are revealed not in grand strategic moves but in mundane operational details, like how many gallons of fuel a truck consumes per mile. By late 1944, the war's momentum had decisively shifted against Germany. Allied forces from the United States, Britain, and Canada had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France toward the German frontier. Behind them, supply officers labored feverishly to keep fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flowing to the fast-moving armies. Every gallon of gasoline had to cross the Atlantic, be unloaded at French ports, and be transported hundreds of miles to the front lines. Fuel efficiency was not merely a peacetime concern, it could determine operational success or failure. The American military had standardized on a series of half-track vehicles for mechanized infantry and artillery support. Foremost among them was the M3 half-track, a vehicle that would become as iconic to the U.S. war effort as the Sherman tank or the Jeep. Produced in the tens of thousands, the M3 was powered by a white 6-cylinder AX engine producing 148 horsepower. While not particularly powerful for a heavy truck, it was reliable, simple to maintain, and crucially, it could be mass-produced using components from American commercial trucks. The M3 could carry a driver and 12 troops in its armored cabin or tow light artillery pieces. Its 60-gallon fuel tank allowed for a range of about 220 miles on paved roads, translating to roughly 3.7 miles per gallon. Off-road in mud or sand, mileage could drop drastically, sometimes as low as 2 miles per gallon. American soldiers understood that their half-tracks were fuel-hungry, but they accepted it as the cost of mechanized mobility. By comparison, the German Sd.Kfz 7 was an entirely different machine. Developed in the mid-1930s as part of Germany's initiative to standardize its military tractor fleet, the Sd.Kfz 7 was engineered to tow heavy artillery, most notably the renowned 88mm flak gun and the 15cm SFH-18 howitzer. Unlike the American M3 half-track, which was designed primarily for transporting infantry, the Sd.Kfz 7 emphasized raw pulling power. It was powered by a Maybach HL62TUK engine, later upgraded to the HL64TR. These 6-cylinder, water-cooled gasoline engines produced 140 horsepower, nearly matching the output of the American white engine. However, the similarities ended there. The Maybach engine had a displacement of 6.2 liters, later increased to 6.4 liters, considerably larger than the American counterpart, and it consumed fuel at rates that would astonish U.S. maintenance crews. According to German technical manuals, the Sd.Kfz 7's fuel consumption on flat roads was approximately 80 liters per 100 kilometers, equivalent to roughly 3 miles per gallon, but that figure assumed ideal conditions, an experienced driver, good roads, and moderate loads. Across the rugged terrain, mud, and snow of the Eastern Front, fuel consumption could soar to 160 liters per 100 kilometers, just 1.5 miles per gallon. The vehicle carried 215 liters of fuel in its tanks, about 57 gallons. On paper, this promised a road range of roughly 250 kilometers, or 155 miles. In reality, under combat conditions, the Sd.Kfz 7 often required refueling after fewer than 75 miles of cross-country travel. During the war, American intelligence analysts had rarely considered these figures. After all, when assessing an enemy, priorities were tanks, armor thickness, and the penetrating power of their guns, not a truck's miles per gallon. But in the spring of 1945, as American forces overran German positions and captured equipment in large numbers, some resourceful soldiers and officers began examining what they had seized. The story truly begins in March 1945 in the Rhineland, as U.S. forces prepared to cross the Rhine River and advance deep into Germany. The Ninth Army, commanded by Lieutenant General William Simpson, had been tasked with a massive river crossing operation. Engineers and logisticians labored continuously to stockpile supplies for the eastward push. Fuel depots were established, bridging equipment readied, and every available vehicle pressed into service. It was during this frantic period of preparation that elements of the 9th Army supply units discovered a nearly intact German motor pool that had been hastily abandoned. Among the vehicles left behind were several Sd.Kfz tractors, apparently left stranded due to fuel shortages, a common fate for German vehicles in the war's final months. Unlike many captured vehicles that had been damaged or stripped of essential components, these German half-tracks were in surprisingly good condition. A young captain in an ordnance company, his name lost to history but whose actions would be noted in after-action reports, made a choice that would reveal crucial insights. Instead of merely cataloging the vehicles for intelligence purposes or sending them to the rear for evaluation, he decided to put them straight into operational use. His unit was in urgent need of heavy towing vehicles to transport artillery and supplies forward, and here were several fully functional tractors just sitting idle. Why not use them? The first obstacle was fuel. The Maybach engines ran on gasoline, the same fuel used by American vehicles, so fuel type was not an issue. Naturally, the Germans had taken most of their fuel when retreating, but American supplies were plentiful. The second challenge was familiarization. None of the American drivers had ever operated a German half-track. The layout of the controls was different, the instruments were labeled in German, and the driving dynamics were entirely unfamiliar. Yet American soldiers have never shied away from figuring out foreign equipment. Within a few hours, each vehicle had an assigned driver. Through some trial and error, occasional stalls, and gear-grinding mishaps, the Sd.Kfz 7s were up and moving. The first impressions were encouraging. The powerful Maybach engine roared to life with authority. The tracks, featuring the distinctive overlapping road wheel design typical of German armor, gripped the muddy terrain with impressive traction. Hitched to a heavy artillery piece, the Sd.Kfz 7 towed it effortlessly. One sergeant later wrote in a letter home that driving the German half-track felt like operating a locomotive, immense power and stability, but heavier and more ponderous than the American vehicles he was accustomed to. Steering required extra effort despite the power assist, and while the suspension was effective, it transmitted more vibration to the crew. Still, the sheer power was undeniable. Where an M3 half-track might struggle with heavy loads or difficult terrain, the Sd.Kfz 7 continued without strain. For the first day or two, everyone was impressed. German engineering at its finest, they thought, sturdy construction, a powerful engine, and excellent traction. Several officers began drafting reports suggesting that some design elements might be worth incorporating into future American vehicles. But then the fuel consumption figures began to arrive, and the narrative changed drastically. Each captured Sd.Kfz 7 had been fueled with a full tank of American gasoline, 57 gallons, roughly the same as an M3. American drivers knew their M3 half-tracks could travel 200 miles or more on a full tank, even while towing artillery. So it came as a shock when the German tractors ran low on fuel after fewer than 90 miles of mixed road and cross-country travel, requiring immediate refills. Initially, the American crews assumed they had made some kind of error. Perhaps there was an unnoticed fuel leak. Perhaps the fuel tanks had not been completely full from the start. Perhaps they had been driving inefficiently, revving the engines too high or using excessive throttle. But as days passed and more miles were logged, a clear pattern emerged. The German half-tracks were consuming fuel at nearly twice the rate of the American M3s. The ordnance captain instructed his men to conduct a systematic experiment. They chose one Sd.Kfz 7 and one M3, both in excellent mechanical condition. The fuel tanks of both vehicles were filled to maximum capacity. Carefully measured, they plotted an identical route, 25 miles of paved road, followed by 15 miles of moderate off-road terrain, then 25 miles back on pavement. Each vehicle would tow a 15 cm howitzer, roughly the same weight both vehicles were designed to handle. The results were shocking. The M3 completed the 65-mile circuit with fuel still remaining in its tank. Based on careful calculations, it consumed approximately 17 gallons, achieving an effective fuel economy of roughly 3.8 miles per gallon. Under the same conditions, the Sd.Kfz 7, running the exact same course, exhausted its entire 57-gallon tank and required an emergency refill to return to base. Post-test analysis showed it had burned about 63 gallons for the same 65-mile distance, equating to barely 1 mile per gallon. Someone in the unit did the math and realized the broader implications. If a battalion's artillery needed to be moved 100 miles using M3 half-tracks, it would consume around 2,600 gallons of fuel, assuming 10 vehicles at 26 gallons each. Using Sd.Kfz 7s for the same task would require roughly 6,300 gallons, more than double. Scaling this up to a division, corps, or entire army level meant tens of thousands of extra gallons of fuel consumed every day. The American officers began to understand a critical insight that would become even clearer as they advanced deeper into Germany. German military vehicles had been designed with the assumption that fuel would always be plentiful. Germany had synthetic fuel plants, captured oil fields in Romania, and expected rapid victories that would secure additional resources, including the oil fields of the Caucasus. Fuel efficiency had not been a design priority. American military planners, in contrast, had always treated every gallon of fuel as precious. Oil had to be shipped across submarine-infested oceans and transported hundreds of miles from ports to frontline units. American industry had engineered engines to maximize every possible mile from each gallon, ensuring efficiency was built into every vehicle from the start. Not because American engineers were inherently smarter, but because American logistics demanded it. The Germans had designed their vehicles for sheer power and performance. The Americans had built theirs with efficiency and long-term sustainability in mind. As more German vehicles were captured by American forces during the spring of 1945, this pattern repeated itself over and over. German trucks, such as the Opel Blitz and various Mercedes-Benz models, consistently burned more fuel per mile than equivalent American vehicles. German armored machines, the Panther and Tiger tanks, were notorious for their insatiable fuel consumption, often achieving less than 1 mile per gallon even on paved roads. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, operated aircraft with prodigious fuel appetites. Intelligence officers began compiling this data, and a clear picture emerged. The German military had been meticulously engineered for short, high-intensity campaigns in which fuel could be captured from the enemy or stockpiled in advance. It was ill-suited for prolonged wars of attrition, where every gallon counted. This limitation had not been obvious during 1939 and 1940 when German forces overran Poland and France within weeks. But by 1943 and 1944, as Germany fought on multiple fronts and Allied bombing campaigns targeted synthetic fuel plants, the extreme fuel demands of German vehicles became a severe strategic vulnerability. American soldiers examining captured Sd.Kfz-7s noticed additional details reinforcing this pattern. The vehicles were constructed like tanks, heavy and over-engineered. Every component prioritized maximum strength rather than optimal efficiency. The Maybach engine, though powerful, was a sophisticated machine with precision fuel injection systems that required careful maintenance and fine-tuning. When these systems were not perfectly calibrated, fuel consumption increased even further. By contrast, the American White engine in the M3 was based on proven commercial truck engine designs. It was simpler, more forgiving of imperfect maintenance, and engineered from the start for fuel efficiency. Decades of American automotive engineering, focused on maximizing fuel economy for civilian users concerned about operating costs, paid enormous dividends when those same principles were applied to military vehicles. The practical implications on the battlefield were significant. An American mechanized infantry company equipped with 12 M3 half-tracks could conduct a full day of combat operations, covering 20 to 30 miles, using roughly 200 gallons of fuel. That same company outfitted with German Sd.Kfz-7s would require nearly 500 gallons for identical operations. Scaling this up to the division level, with hundreds of vehicles, the disparity became staggering. American logistics planners had calculated that a frontline division required approximately 50,000 gallons of fuel per day to sustain all its vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, and support equipment combined. A German panzer division, equipped with its less fuel-efficient vehicles, required nearly 75,000 gallons of fuel per day. When Germany was advancing and capturing enemy fuel supplies, this was manageable. However, during retreats and with Allied bombers targeting fuel production facilities, this became impossible. In the spring of 1945, American soldiers operating captured Sd.Kfz-7s quickly discovered that they had to stop for fuel roughly twice as often as they would with their own M3 half-tracks. They watched fuel gauges drop alarmingly fast and gained an immediate, visceral understanding of why so many German vehicles had been abandoned on roadsides with empty tanks. These vehicles had not been left behind due to mechanical failure. They had been abandoned because they had literally run out of gasoline. One especially revealing incident occurred in early April 1945, as American forces pushed through central Germany. A supply convoy, comprising both American M3s and captured Sd.Kfz-7s, was tasked with transporting ammunition and supplies to a forward artillery position about 80 miles behind the rapidly advancing front lines. The convoy departed the supply depot early in the morning, with all vehicles fully fueled. The American M3 half-tracks completed the round trip without needing to refuel, returning to base with fuel to spare. In contrast, The German half-tracks, running the exact same route under identical conditions, required a mid-route refueling stop. Without that emergency resupply, they would have been stranded. The convoy commander, a major with extensive logistics experience, included this observation in his after-action report, noting German vehicles unsuitable for sustained operations due to excessive fuel consumption. This was far from an isolated case. Across Germany in the spring of 1945, similar situations unfolded whenever American units attempted to use captured German vehicles. A tank recovery unit discovered that German heavy tank recovery vehicles, variants of the Sd.Kfz-9, could tow disabled tanks that American recovery vehicles struggled with. However, these German recovery vehicles needed refueling so frequently that the time saved by their superior pulling power was lost entirely due to constant stops for fuel. An artillery battalion that briefly employed captured Sd.Kfz-7s to tow 105 mm howitzers reported that the German tractors offered better traction in muddy terrain compared to American vehicles. Yet, the same report noted that the German tractors required accompanying fuel trucks for every movement, negating their tactical advantage by increasing convoy size and vulnerability. American soldiers also observed that the fuel tanks on German vehicles appeared poorly designed relative to the vehicle's actual consumption. In contrast, the M3's 60-gallon fuel tank had been carefully sized to provide adequate operational range for typical missions. The Sd.Kfz-7's fuel tank held 215 liters, roughly 57 gallons, which was actually slightly undersized relative to the vehicle's mass and intended role. Combined with its exceptionally high fuel consumption, this meant the vehicle required refueling far more frequently than American crews were accustomed to. It appeared that German engineers had not fully anticipated how much fuel these vehicles would consume under real combat conditions. Some American maintenance crews experimented with ways to improve the efficiency of the captured German vehicles. They attempted different driving techniques, modified fuel mixtures, and fine-tuned carburetors. While these measures produced modest gains, perhaps improving fuel economy by 5 to 10%, they could not overcome the fundamental design reality. The Maybach engine, paired with such a large, heavy chassis, was inherently thirstier than the American alternative. The irony was clear to American drivers and tank crews. Operating deep in the heart of Germany, relying on fuel shipped all the way from Texas and Oklahoma, they were keeping German-designed vehicles running smoothly. Meanwhile, German forces fighting on their home territory could not keep their own vehicles fueled. This stark contrast revealed the unsustainability of the German war machine. German fuel production had peaked in early 1944 at around 5.7 million tons per year. By spring 1945, it had collapsed to under 1 million tons annually, a decline of over 80%. Allied bombing raids against synthetic fuel plants, particularly the concentrated attacks during the summer of 1944, had devastated the German fuel supply. The loss of the Romanian oil fields to advancing Soviet forces in August 1944 further eliminated a critical resource. In response, the German military attempted strict fuel rationing. By early 1945, frontline fuel allocations were repeatedly reduced. Training flights for Luftwaffe pilots were cancelled to conserve fuel. Tank units were instructed to minimize movement wherever possible. Even horse-drawn wagons and carts, long considered obsolete in the mechanized age, reappeared as German units tried to preserve their remaining fuel for combat vehicles. Yet rationing could not solve the underlying problem. German vehicles consumed far too much fuel. Even with strict allocations, panzer divisions frequently became immobilized. They were unable to maneuver to counter Allied attacks, retreat to stronger defensive positions, or advance to exploit tactical opportunities. Instead, they often remained stationary, waiting for fuel that never arrived, until Allied forces overran them. After-action reports from this period contain numerous examples of this problem. One armored division report described a captured Panther tank that performed admirably during a short-range engagement, only to be abandoned after 15 miles because it had exhausted all fuel, and the American supply system could not keep it operational. Another report from an engineering battalion noted that captured Sd.Kfz-7s were useful for short-distance heavy hauling, but their excessive fuel consumption had led to their gradual removal from regular use. Some American units continued to operate captured German vehicles, but only for specific short-distance tasks where their raw power outweighed the drawbacks of excessive fuel consumption. A handful of Sd.Kfz-7s were repurposed as stationary power sources, their engines running generators at forward bases. Others were simply parked and dismantled for spare parts. The German half-tracks, once hailed as symbols of mechanized warfare efficiency, were now regarded by American soldiers as examples of impractical over-engineering. A broader lesson was becoming evident across all levels of the American military. German equipment appeared formidable, sounded impressive, and in short-term tactical scenarios often performed admirably. Yet the German military had failed to solve a fundamental challenge of modern mechanized warfare, maintaining a reliable fuel supply for its vehicles. The Americans had addressed this problem not through a single technological breakthrough, but through meticulous attention to logistics and fuel efficiency. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, famously stated that amateurs talk strategy while professionals talk logistics. The stark contrast in fuel consumption between American and German vehicles perfectly illustrated this principle. While the Germans had built tactically superior vehicles in many respects, the Panther tank with superior armor and a more powerful gun than the Sherman, the Sd.Kfz 7 capable of towing heavier loads than the M3, these advantages were meaningless if the vehicles could not be consistently fueled. The American logistics network, often overlooked in accounts of World War II, was arguably one of America's greatest military accomplishments. Crude oil was extracted from wells in Texas and California, refined into gasoline and diesel, loaded onto tankers, and shipped across the Atlantic while evading German submarines. Upon arrival in Britain or France, the fuel was transferred to trains or trucks and transported hundreds of miles to forward fuel depots. From these depots, fuel was distributed to divisional supply points and ultimately delivered to individual units, down to the company level. This vast system, spanning from the oil fields of Texas to the front lines in Germany, moved millions of gallons of fuel every day. American logisticians calculated that every gallon of fuel reaching a frontline tank required roughly 4 gallons total when accounting for fuel consumed by ships and trucks during transport. Yet the system worked. In the final year of the war, American units rarely faced fuel shortages. In contrast, the German logistics apparatus had completely collapsed. Synthetic fuel plants, which had provided much of Germany's supply, were systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The Romanian oil fields, lost to Soviet advances in August 1944, removed another crucial source of fuel. By spring 1945, German fuel production had dwindled to only a fraction of what it had been just a year earlier. Even the limited fuel Germany continued to produce had to be spread across multiple fronts, with railways and roads constantly under attack from Allied aircraft. Yet even if Germany had somehow maintained its fuel production, the excessive fuel consumption of its vehicles would have remained a critical problem. A study conducted by American intelligence in mid-1945 estimated that Germany would have needed roughly 25% more fuel just to sustain the same operational pace that American forces maintained using their more fuel-efficient vehicles. Germany's fuel-guzzling vehicles were not only problematic when fuel was scarce, they would have posed a logistical burden even under ideal conditions. This comparison extended beyond just half-tracks. American tank crews observed that captured German Panther tanks, while heavily armed and armored, consumed fuel at an astonishing rate of roughly half a mile per gallon. In contrast, a Sherman tank achieved nearly 1 mile per gallon. Consequently, a Panther-equipped armored division required twice as many fuel trucks, twice as many fuel depots, and double the logistical support compared to a Sherman-equipped division. German tank destroyers, including vehicles such as the Jagdpanther and Jagdtiger, were even more extreme. These heavily armed vehicles mounted powerful guns on tank chassis, providing significant tactical advantages. They could destroy any Allied tank from long range, but they were among the most fuel-inefficient vehicles ever designed. American tankers examining captured Jagdtigers after the war were astonished that Germany had attempted to deploy such machines. One officer's report noted that a Jagdtiger consumed more fuel running idle for 1 hour than a Sherman used traveling 10 miles. By April 1945, as American forces advanced deeper into Germany and the Third Reich collapsed around them, thousands of captured German vehicles were abandoned along roadsides. Many had been damaged or destroyed in combat, but a substantial number were simply left behind when their fuel tanks ran dry. German soldiers abandoned these vehicles not because of mechanical failure, but because there was no gasoline remaining to operate them. American intelligence officers compiled extensive reports on German fuel stocks and vehicle consumption rates. The figures painted a grim picture. At the height of German military power in 1941 and 1942, the nation had only barely produced or captured enough fuel to keep its war machine operational. As the war dragged on, Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants and the loss of Romanian oil fields to Soviet advances caused fuel supplies to collapse. By 1944, German panzer divisions were frequently immobilized, not due to enemy action, but because they had no fuel. The Battle of the Bulge, from December 1944 to January 1945, represented Germany's final major offensive in the West. One of the operation's fundamental assumptions was that German forces would quickly capture American fuel depots early in the offensive and rely on the seized fuel to sustain their advance. When that expectation failed, when American defenders held key fuel depots or destroyed them before retreating, the German offensive literally ran dry. Panther and Tiger tanks were discovered abandoned with empty fuel tanks just a few miles from their starting points. The Ardennes offensive had been planned with explicit acknowledgement of Germany's fuel limitations. German planners calculated that their fuel reserves would allow them to reach the Meuse River roughly halfway to their ultimate goal of Antwerp, but only if they successfully captured American fuel supplies along the route. This assumption was extraordinarily risky, essentially wagering the success of an entire offensive on the hope of seizing enemy resources. When the attack began on December 16, some German units did capture minor American fuel dumps, but the amounts were far too small to sustain the many vehicles involved. American defenders, fully aware of the fuel issue, focused on defending or destroying fuel stocks at Stavelot. Engineers demolished a fuel depot containing hundreds of thousands of gallons just hours before German forces arrived, producing an explosion audible for miles. German armored spearheads, including units equipped with Sd.Kfz-7s and other heavy vehicles, found themselves immobilized as early as December 18, only 2 days into the offensive. Some Panther tanks traveled fewer than 30 miles before exhausting their fuel. Sd.Kfz-7 tractors towing artillery pieces were abandoned when they could not reach the infantry units they were meant to support. The offensive, which Hitler had hoped would split the Allied armies, stalled almost entirely because of fuel shortages. American intelligence officers, interrogating captured German soldiers after the Battle of the Bulge, repeatedly heard the same story. German units had been ordered to advance and attempted to do so, but had halted because they ran out of fuel. Tank commanders described watching their fuel gauges drop toward empty while waiting for supply trucks that never arrived. Sd.Kfz-7 drivers recounted leaving their vehicles within sight of their objectives because they had burned all their fuel just reaching the battlefield. One captured German lieutenant, interrogated in January 1945, told his American captors that his artillery unit's Sd.Kfz-7 tractors had consumed all their fuel during the initial advance and had been immobilized ever since. His guns remained silent during critical phases of the battle, not due to a lack of ammunition, of which there was plenty, but because the tractors needed to move them to new firing positions had no fuel. The Americans filing the interrogation reports noted with grim humor that German engineering had produced vehicles so powerful that they could not actually be used. The fuel consumption of German vehicles became a recurring topic among American soldiers in the winter and spring of 1945. GIs traded stories about captured vehicles, comparing performance. One corporal wrote home about driving a captured German half-track, noting its impressive engineering, only to realize it required refueling twice as often as his standard American vehicle. A sergeant in a maintenance company recounted his efforts to keep a captured Sd.Kfz-7 operational, only to discover that its fuel tank was completely empty after just 60 miles of use. These were not merely amusing stories, they revealed a crucial insight into why the Allies were prevailing in the war. The American military had constructed a sustainable, enduring war machine, whereas the German military had created one that could not be maintained under prolonged conditions. German vehicles often excelled in isolated performance metrics, they were faster, more powerful, and better armored. Yet, when fuel consumption, maintenance demands, and logistical sustainability were taken into account, American vehicles were superior where it truly mattered. As American soldiers moved through the battlefields in early 1945, the evidence was unmistakable. Powerful German machines, beautifully engineered, were left stranded across the terrain. Some American GIs even spray-painted messages on abandoned German tanks, writing things like "out of gas" or "thanks for the memories." There was a grim humor in this, but also a recognition of a fundamental truth: Germany had lost the fuel war long before it lost the shooting war. The Sd.Kfz-7 became a symbol of this failure. It was not as celebrated as the Tiger or Panther tanks, but for American soldiers tasked with operating captured German vehicles, it epitomized everything that was flawed about German military planning. This was a vehicle capable of feats beyond American machines. It could tow heavier loads and traverse more challenging terrain, but it required twice the fuel to achieve those capabilities. In a conflict where fuel logistics dictated operational success, this extra consumption was no trivial matter, it was a critical vulnerability. Some German officers, reflecting after the war, would attribute Germany's defeat to Allied numerical superiority, strategic bombing, or the burden of fighting a two-front war. While these factors were significant, at the tactical level, where individual soldiers and small units fought and survived or perished, the fuel consumption problem was immediate and inescapable. German units in 1945 were frequently immobilized, they could neither maneuver nor retreat nor advance due to a lack of fuel. American units, on the other hand, rarely faced such shortages. The American logistics system, despite occasional hiccups, consistently delivered fuel to frontline units. American trucks and half-tracks might not have matched German vehicles in raw power, but they could keep moving. In a war where mobility equated to survival, that reliability made all the difference. The young captain who first tested captured Sd.Kfz 7S against American M3s likely did not realize he was recording a significant strategic lesson. He was merely attempting to determine whether these seized vehicles were worth using. Yet his simple fuel consumption comparison revealed a profound asymmetry between American and German approaches to mechanized warfare. The Germans had prioritized sheer power and performance, while the Americans had emphasized efficiency, sustainability, and practical operational endurance. The Americans had focused on efficiency and long-term sustainability. In a brief conflict, the German approach might have sufficed, but over a prolonged war, the American strategy proved essential. By May 1945, when Germany formally surrendered, the American military had seized thousands of German vehicles. Some of these were shipped back to the United States for in-depth technical analysis. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland dismantled German engines, studied their fuel injection systems, and examined their transmission designs. Their findings confirmed what frontline soldiers had already observed: German vehicles were engineering marvels in many respects, yet they were extraordinarily inefficient in fuel usage. The testing at Aberdeen was comprehensive. German engines were placed on dynamometers and run through full power cycles. Fuel consumption was recorded under controlled laboratory conditions at various loads and speeds. The results validated the field reports. The Maybach HL62 engine powering the Sd.Kfz 7 consumed roughly 30% more fuel per horsepower than the American White 160AX engine. This inefficiency was not due to poor design. The Maybach was quite advanced, but because German engineers had optimized it for power density and reliability, rather than for fuel economy. American engineers identified several specific design factors that contributed to excessive fuel consumption. The Maybach engine operated with a relatively low compression ratio, reducing thermal efficiency. Its complex carburetor system often ran rich, supplying more fuel than strictly necessary to ensure consistent operation in all conditions. The engine's timing was conservatively set to maximize power output rather than optimize fuel efficiency. Each of these factors alone would have been manageable, but combined, they caused a dramatic increase in fuel use. The Americans also studied the full powertrain of the Sd.Kfz 7. The transmission, though durable, had relatively wide gear ratios, forcing the engine to run at higher RPMs than necessary. The final drive ratios were configured to prioritize towing capacity over cruising efficiency. While these choices made sense for a vehicle designed for maximum performance, they were detrimental to fuel economy. A comparative report issued by Aberdeen in September 1945 concluded that the Sd.Kfz 7 exemplified excellent German engineering applied to the wrong design priorities. The report emphasized that if American engineers had been given the same basic requirements, towing 8 tons, carrying 12 men, and operating in all terrain, they would have produced a very different vehicle. The American design philosophy would have emphasized fuel efficiency and ease of maintenance over maximum performance. These lessons influenced post-war American military vehicle development. As the Army began creating new generations of armored vehicles and trucks in the late 1940s and 1950s, fuel efficiency became a central design criterion. American military planners never forgot the striking image of powerful German tanks left abandoned along the roadside, emptied of fuel. They retained the clear understanding that in modern warfare, the side capable of keeping its vehicles fueled and operational would inevitably outlast the side that built stronger but less sustainable machines. The impact of these wartime lessons was evident in American vehicle development during the 1950s. The M59 armored personnel carrier, which succeeded the M3 half-track, was deliberately designed with fuel efficiency as a priority. Despite being larger, it achieved approximately 4 miles per gallon, surpassing the M3. This focus on fuel economy continued with the M113 armored personnel carrier, introduced in the 1960s. Military specifications for new vehicles explicitly incorporated fuel consumption targets. By comparison, Soviet vehicle development followed a different path. Although the Soviets had also experienced German fuel inefficiency, their conclusions diverged. Operating within a nation with abundant oil resources, Soviet designers were less concerned about fuel economy. Cold War-era Soviet armored vehicles were notoriously fuel-hungry, in some cases consuming even more fuel per mile than German vehicles from World War II. However, the Soviets had the production capacity to sustain this approach, whereas the Germans did not. The economic consequences of these fuel consumption differences were enormous. By early 1945, American forces in Europe used roughly 300 million gallons of gasoline per month. If American vehicles had operated at German fuel consumption rates, this monthly figure would have surged to around 500 million gallons. The additional demand would have required more fuel tankers, expanded port facilities, additional trucks, and greater logistical capacity overall. Such inefficiencies could have delayed Allied operations by months or even rendered some operations impossible. Germany, with far more limited fuel reserves, could never have maintained American-style operational tempo, and with German-level fuel inefficiency, German forces often became immobilized even while defending their own territory. Many historians argue that Germany's fuel shortage was the single most critical material limitation shaping the outcome of the war in the West. In the final year of the conflict, German units frequently could not maneuver not due to a shortage of vehicles or trained crews, but simply because they had run out of fuel. The Sd.Kfz-7 itself experienced an unusual post-war life. Some captured examples continued to be used by Allied forces for a few years following the war. The Czechoslovak army operated several of these vehicles until the early 1950s. Built with exceptional durability, the Sd.Kfz-7 could function for years with proper maintenance. However, its notorious fuel consumption meant that once more efficient alternatives became available, these vehicles were quickly retired. Today, a small number of surviving Sd.Kfz-7s are preserved in military museums worldwide. These machines remain imposing and impressive, their tall frames, distinctive tracked suspension, and powerful appearance capturing the attention of visitors. Museumgoers often admire the rugged construction and envision these tractors towing 88mm flak guns across European battlefields. Yet, the placards seldom highlight a crucial detail: the vehicle's fuel consumption. Rarely do they mention that these mighty machines needed to refuel twice as frequently as their American counterparts. The American GIs who operated these captured vehicles in 1945 never forgot. In later years, during reunions and in memoirs, many would recall their experiences with a blend of respect and humor. Yes, the German half-track was undeniably powerful. Yes, it could perform remarkable feats, but it guzzled fuel at an astonishing rate. Soldiers could almost watch the fuel gauge plummet as they drove. There is a broader lesson about technology in warfare here: the most impressive weapon is not necessarily the most effective one. Performance alone does not guarantee success, sustainability matters even more. A tank capable of defeating any enemy in a one-on-one duel is useless if it cannot reach the battlefield due to running out of fuel. A half-track strong enough to tow the heaviest artillery becomes a liability if it requires a dedicated fuel truck to follow it everywhere. The Germans learned this lesson too late. By the time they recognized that fuel efficiency needed to be a design priority, they were already losing the war and lacked the industrial capacity to redesign or replace their vehicle fleet. The Americans, whether through foresight or luck, had created a military machine with efficiency in mind from the very beginning. When American soldiers stepped out of the captured Sd.Kfz-7s in the spring of 1945 and calculated the fuel these massive German tractors had consumed, they grasped a lesson that historians would analyze for decades. The Third Reich had not merely failed strategically or tactically, it had failed logistically. The German military had constructed a force dependent on resources it could not sustain. The Americans, in contrast, had built a military capable of maintaining operations as long as American factories kept producing and supply ships continued to sail. Fuel consumption was just one metric among thousands, but it was telling. It revealed that German engineering brilliance, real as it was in many areas, had been applied in the wrong direction. The Germans had optimized their vehicles for performance under ideal conditions, while the Americans optimized theirs for performance under realistic constraints. When the pressures of a multi-year global conflict became evident, the American approach proved superior. Ultimately, the German Sd.Kfz-7 and the American M3 half-track conveyed contrasting stories about their nation's approaches to warfare. The Sd.Kfz-7 embodied the German belief that superior quality and raw performance alone would guarantee victory. The M3 represented the American philosophy that combining sufficient quality with superior numbers and sustainable design would ultimately win out. History confirmed this perspective. When military historians examine why Germany lost World War II, they cite numerous factors: the two-front war, disparities in industrial capacity, strategic bombing, tactical mistakes, ideological extremism, and many others. Yet, hidden in all those analyses should be a note on fuel consumption. How German vehicles burned gasoline at nearly twice the rate of American vehicles. How American soldiers could hardly believe how voracious captured German half-tracks were. How the formidable Sd.Kfz-7, despite its power and capabilities, required refueling so frequently that American troops began to see it as more of a liability than an advantage. The German soldier operating an Sd.Kfz-7 in 1941, racing across the Russian steppes with captured Soviet fuel in his tanks, probably never thought twice about efficiency. There was always more fuel at the next supply point. But by 1945, German troops struggling to operate the same vehicle saw their fuel gauges drop toward empty with no depot in sight and understood the problem far too clearly. German logistics had failed to keep pace with German ambitions, and the vehicles themselves had been designed under the assumption that fuel would never be a limiting factor. The Americans, whether out of pragmatism or a keen awareness of logistical realities, built vehicles that could continue to operate even under tight supply conditions. An M3 could stretch its tank to reach the next supply point. An Sd.Kfz-7 could not. In the brutal, attritional warfare of 1944 to 1945, this difference proved decisive. So, when we reflect on the mechanized warfare of World War II, when we think about half-tracks, trucks, and the vehicles that moved armies across continents, we should remember the story of fuel consumption. We should recall the American soldiers who climbed into captured German vehicles and discovered that German engineering brilliance came with a hidden cost. We should recognize that some of the most critical victories are not won on the battlefield but at the fuel pump. In a conflict where every gallon mattered, the side that built more fuel-efficient vehicles held an advantage as tangible and decisive as superior tactics or better-trained soldiers. The Sd.Kfz-7 was indeed a remarkable machine. Yet, in the end, it also symbolized why Germany could not sustain its war effort. Power without sustainability leads to weakness. Performance without efficiency leads to failure. American GIs learned that lesson firsthand in the spring of 1945, driving captured German half-tracks that kept running out of fuel. It was a lesson that would influence American military thinking for generations. If you want, I can now merge all your rephrased Sd.Kfz-7 scripts into one long, continuous narrative, polished and ready for a YouTube documentary or video narration. It would flow seamlessly from the start of World War II German half-tracks to the final lessons learned by the Americans.